Okay, hi Year 11s, back again for part 2 of Whitechapel, and we're at the top of page 11. And here, at the top of page 11, Whitechapel is remembering the death of his second wife, and there's a beautiful description here that a slow death that took so long, I willed it to come, get its work done, and get out of my life. And it's not that he's desiring his wife to die, but more that she's having such a long, painful death. He doesn't want his wife to suffer. And he's almost that idea of putting somebody out of a misery, that idea of euthanasia or just being able to give a relief, a dignified death. That's here at the top here of page 11. And she says, "Don't keep me waiting. Join me in heaven soon." And then she dies here. And so it describes then at the bottom of page 11 how the next dawn, so the next morning, he's decided to run away. And I sent my son in my place less than a full day later. It means less than a full day after my wife died, I sent my son to heaven. So that sent really implies responsibility. And he then says his regret for that death. "Now I can't die because I can't face her blaming me for sending him ahead of me." So he's fearful of her reaction, that she also knows that he is to blame. I couldn't protect my son, is that kind of feeling or connotations there. So we'll turn over onto page 12. And here, at the top of page 12, the note that I've made is that he's longing for death. You can see that because he's seeing the stars, and one day I'll see them and they'll be the last thing that I see. And sit down, grandfather, will be no more, and glad because of it. And a smile might turn up my turned down mouth. So here at the top of page 12, there's this sense that he is longing for death. He's desiring death. He's lived a long life, over 100 years, and he wants to be free of that pain. And maybe he also feels like he deserves death because of the grief that he's caused. And now, from the middle of page 12, he goes through his thought processes in the choices he made with his son. So, it was a simple lesson on obedience was all my boy required. He needed to know his station. He needed to have this idea driven from his wild head, which it says here, any notion of freedom from responsibility. He was born, owned by another man like his father before him and like his son would be born. And I thought this was a really important sentence. So I've noted that there is this, if you note the words here, this implicit acceptance of generational slavery. So even the slaves accept that they're born slaves, that Whitechapel represents this view of the acceptance of being a slave. And then he talks about there's this increasing number of runaways. So young people are starting to run away, and he worries about them. They say they're going to paradise, and what they mean is paradise like a heaven on earth where they can be free. And what he means by paradise, damn right I shout, is heaven. So what Whitechapel means is when they run away, they're going to get killed, caught, killed on the spot, and sent to heaven. So we have the younger generation who are starting to oppose slavery by running away, and his fear for his son, starting to say here that he'll end up in paradise, but not paradise on earth, paradise in heaven. So run from here and you'll die. And that's the view that Whitechapel has. And it says here, my boy listened, shook his head, but had the grace to keep quiet. So he's disagreeing with his father, but allowing him to speak anyway out of respect. And then we'll come up to the top of page 13. Okay. And so Whitechapel decides he needed to learn for himself, that there would be a lesson if he actually rebelled and was perhaps taught his place. There is this sentence here, shows here the acceptance of the status quo. It was my view that a slave could live a good long life if he worked hard and presented to his master the most dignified aspect of himself, in order to reciprocate the same manner from his master, the same civility, fairness, and even kindness once the relationship grew warm and cordial. Yeah. So this is Whitechapel's philosophy, that you'd be a good, dignified slave and you'd get respect from your masters. And he was trying to save his son from himself with this lesson. He was distracted by the death of his second wife. And at the bottom here, when thinking about the death of his wife, he's thinking about her situation. So again, it's sort of jumping back in time here, but she needed attention and I was relieved of my duties so that I could attend to her needs. Who could get that degree of consideration shown them? So it really suggests, well, my master is so kind because he's allowed me to take time off my duties so that I can look after my wife. And Whitechapel sees it as kindness, but as a reader today, the modern reader, we actually see that's just a common courtesy. That's what would be the least of what we would expect, and that actually it's not necessarily kindness indeed, but rather there's a kind of patronising kind of view. And here on the next page, there's another line that kind of goes, if you look here on page 14, there's another set that really talks and shows you that view that these slaves don't even deserve a doctor. So I could not convince the master to pay a physician to look at her, but he did argue and convince me that her time had come and not everyone was able to be an old ox like me. So he convinced me that it was just my wife's time, that the master wouldn't pay for a doctor, but he sort of said, look, it's just her time. And this seemed acceptable to Whitechapel, so I made her last days comfortable. And the acceptance of this unfair treatment, the inferior situation here, this inferiority, there's such a tone of acceptance that he doesn't even think that it's something that he might question. And it really has this effect of evoking sympathy in the modern reader who can see the unfairness of the views at the time. And then we come back to her death and how he was exhausted, and then he didn't even notice his son going because he was grieving for his wife. And then he was fearful of his son, and here is where he made his decision. I knew what I had to do. And his views here, two types of slave: the slave who must experience everything for himself before coming to an understanding of anything, and he who learns through observation. So one type of slave who basically will rebel, and the second type of slave who will be submissive. So his son is the first type of slave. Okay. My son was in this troublesome category, the first category. So he's going to experience it for himself. He's going to rebel. And his fear here is beautifully described in a simile. My heartbeat rattled like the start of rain on a roof before steadying again with the rhythm of a downpour. He resolved to save his son. So his motivation in making his decision is to try and save his son. And so he decides to knock on his master's door, and Mr. Whitechapel opens the door. He's irritated, surprised, and here, even in the tone that he speaks, Whitechapel the slave speaks, I begged his pardon, wished God's blessings on him and his 2 sons and 1 daughter and good wife. And the notes that I've made here on the side is that he's using a fawning tone. He's imploring, he's begging. That really shows his submissiveness. And he explains what happened with his son, that he's been an impulsive idiot. And that so Whitechapel the slave makes a proposal that would punish him, make him a compliant servant, but obviously save his life. Here, the top of page 16, or third of the way through page 16, what to note is that he's using God. So God was just and fair, and I should accept his judgment on us all. And certainly this is a historical view that Christianity and God was used to justify slavery. And it's something now in the modern era that modern readers can definitely see and condemn this view, but at the time it was a widely held view that slaves did not need to receive treatment like a human being, I guess. And biblical principles like that didn't apply. Later on in the letters, we'll see that. And here he confesses, I know where my son has gone. And at the top of page 17, he's gone to paradise on earth, gone to find it. He's gone north, taking the river path. And I'm begging for leniency because of his grief. He's grieving for his mother who's just passed away. And the master did here give orders for a man to catch the trackers and for the son not to be harmed, and an example was going to be made for him. And turn over to page 18, the top of page 18. And here describes the top of 18, describes all of the house slaves, most of them related to Whitechapel. They cast him disdainful looks. You'd believe I'd thrown my own son to the lions. So they considered him like a Judas, the betrayer. They did not understand. And then we come over to page 19, describes how the master had to leave. Later on we learn the family are leaving and why, but just temporarily for a visit. They're not leaving permanently, but here, the middle of page 19, there's issues that because I'm going, my son was to be locked up and have punishment when I return. But then what happens, as we know, page 20, when he is actually caught, the deputy who heard the order isn't there, the master isn't there, and so it's only the overseer, Sanders Jr., who is there. Dusk crept into the plantation, stole into the halls and rooms of the building. This is the technique of personification here. While they're out searching for his son, Whitechapel still thinks that catching his son is going to save him. He's praying that they caught his son. Please God, let it be the first. Let them succeed in apprehending my son. And I've written here, perhaps Whitechapel has a fear of freedom, or perhaps it's also a desperate desire to survive, for survival over all else. So when he arrives, the son is caught, and he arrives, he's alive. He physically turns his body away from his father, and there's this whole idea that represents a symbolic of his rejection of his betrayal. And we learn that only I could save him. He still believes that he can save his son. And in order to save his son, he went to the one person who had the authority to decide. That is Mr. Whitechapel. And Mr. Sanders, the overseer, refuses to hear the words from the deputy. The deputy's disappeared. He refuses to hear those words. And even though Whitechapel said they were witnessed by 4 others besides myself, he ordered me to shut up or be lashed. And he, in fact, is hit by Mr. Sanders. Here in the middle. Page 24, if you'll turn over. Quite like this metaphor here, that he threw off his shame and donned an armour of rage. And this, in the way that Mr. Sanders speaks, has a derogatory tone. Derisive is another word you could use. Derisive tone here. He calls him nigger a number of times. Okay, that word nigger really symbolises that tone here. And there's a violent description of the lashes. Come back to that memory of the death, which is how it starts the chapter. And remembering his son calling out to his mother. He sends his grandchild to run off to see if he could find the deputy. And Whitechapel begs to take his place, but is just laughed off. And here, 26 and 27. The night was torn to ribbons by their grief. This poetic description of grief evokes an emotional response from the reader. And here in the middle, it says, I killed my son because I wanted him next to me when I died. That I was afraid that when he would disappear, he might not come back perhaps, or not sure what it might be getting at, but I think it's a powerful statement that his own fear killed his son. And at the bottom here, so it is that my great-grandson can knock me down, discard my fallen body, leave me winded and concussed, and think nothing of it. So this is the reason why everyone disrespects him, an elder of the family, grandfather, great-grandfather. They can run into me and kill me, bludgeon me with a stick. They all blame me for the death of my son. There is blood on my conscience. My memory is longer than time. This is, and again, another connection to the name of the book there. And this page 27, the intense grief can really be seen in this confused style of writing. There's a tone of torment. There's the short staccato sentences mixed with poetry of description, metaphors, and a sense of hopelessness and despair. And at the end, he's wishing for death. And so that's the last or the rest of Whitechapel. Hope that that's useful for you and you've made lots of notes that you can use in your essay. Thank you all, and Mrs. Williams out.